Hey everybody, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely. Always ready to dive in.
Great. Well, today we're going deep into the brain,
Okay.
specifically its traffic control system.
Sounds complex.
It is, but it's fascinating too. Think about it. You've got billions of neurons firing signals constantly.
Yeah.
How does your brain manage all that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's amazing how everything just seems to work.
Right. Well, some researchers at Durham University are trying to figure that out. Like, how does the brain keep everything from just short-circuiting?
And what have they found?
Well, they've been studying a particular type of brain cell that acts like a traffic cop.
Interesting. A traffic cop.
Yeah. Directing the flow of all that neural information.
So like making sure the right signals get to the right places.
Exactly. And what they've discovered about these cells, it's pretty mind-blowing. I mean, it could change how we understand all kinds of things about the brain, how we form memories, even neurological disorders.
Wow, it sounds like some groundbreaking work. It is. So before we get into the actual study, can we just back up a second and talk about these traffic cop cells? Like, what are they exactly?
Sure. So they're called interneurons. And they're essential for regulating all the communication that's going on between the other neurons in your brain.
Okay, so they're like the organizers, making sure everything runs smoothly.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
See, if all the neurons in your brain were just firing constantly, it'd be total chaos, like a city with only green lights, no stop signs.
Whoa. Yeah, that would be a mess.
Total gridlock. So these interneurons, they act like a braking system. They prevent all that runaway neural activity.
So it's not just about directing traffic, but like maintaining order, making sure things don't get out of hand.
Exactly. Imagine if the neuron responsible for, moving your arm kept firing uncontrollably. Your arm would just keep moving.
Huh.
Interneurons help prevent that. They got to step in and say, whoa there, slow down.
I see. So they're like the guardians of balance in the brain.
You could say that. And the fascinating thing is, there isn't just one type of interneuron. There are lots of different kinds, all with specific jobs, regulating brain activity.
Wow, so it's a whole complex network within an even bigger complex network.
Definitely. Some interneurons just work on nearby neurons, but others have long-range connections across different parts of the brain.
That is complex. So tell me, what were the researchers at Durham University looking at specifically?
Well, they wanted to understand how interneurons work in the hippocampus.
The hippocampus. Wait, refresh my memory. What does that do again?
It's the part of the brain that's super important for learning and memory. Think of it as your brain's filing cabinet.
Oh, right. The hippocampus. And how did they study the interneurons there?
Well, the team, led by Dr. Marco Bocchio, they used some pretty advanced techniques, including this thing called optogenetics.
Optogenetics, what's that?
It's pretty wild, actually. They can activate specific neurons using light.
Wait, what? Control brain cells with light? How does that even work?
It's a game changer in neuroscience, let me tell you. It gives researchers this amazing level of control over brain circuits. They can literally turn neurons on and off using light.
So they can see what happens in the brain when they activate specific cells.
Exactly.
Okay, so back to the study. They were looking at interneurons in the hippocampus. What did they actually find?
Well, here's the truly fascinating part. They found that activating just one single interneuron, just one in the hippocampus, didn't just affect that cell, but actually triggered a whole cascade of activity across a huge network of neurons.
Wow, so like a domino effect. One interneuron setting off a chain reaction.
Yeah, and not only that, but the activity was all synchronized. Imagine one tiny cell setting off this wave of coordinated activity across the brain. Pretty incredible, right?
That's wild. And what does that mean for how our brains actually work?
Well, for one, it challenges the old view that brain function is all neatly organized in specific regions. This suggests that individual cells, like these interneurons, can have these really widespread effects.
So one tiny cell influencing activity across the entire brain.
It seems that way. And the researchers think that this synchronized activity that they observed, it's probably super important for how we form memories and process experiences. It's like the brain is an orchestra and the interneurons are the conductors, making sure everything plays together in harmony.
I love that analogy. The brain as an orchestra and these tiny interneurons conducting the whole thing.
Yeah. Amazing, isn't it?
It is, but it also makes you wonder, what happens if these interneurons don't function properly? What are the consequences of that?
That's a question with big implications, especially when we start thinking about neurological disorders. Well, yeah, a lot of neurological disorders are thought to involve problems with interneurons.
Okay, so what kind of disorders are we talking about here?
Well, let's start with epilepsy.
Epilepsy. So how do interneurons play a role in that?
Well, epilepsy is characterized by those seizures, right?
Right, yeah, those uncontrolled bursts of electrical activity in the brain.
Exactly. And research is showing that problems with certain types of interneurons can make the brain way more susceptible to those kinds of uncontrolled bursts, like the delicate balance gets disrupted.
Oh, I see, like the brakes aren't working properly and things just go haywire.
That's a good way to think about it. And it seems that different types of interneurons are involved in different kinds of epilepsy. Like some interneurons release this neurotransmitter called GABA.
GABA.
Yeah, GABA. And it has an inhibitory effect on other neurons. Kind of calms things down.
Okay, so if those GABA interneurons aren't working right, it can lead to too much excitation, which can then cause seizures.
Precisely.
Makes sense. So what about autism? You mentioned that earlier. How are interneurons involved in autism?
Well, autism is a pretty complex disorder, right?
Yeah, it affects people in so many different ways.
Right, exactly. But, there's more and more evidence suggesting that problems with interneurons, like how they develop and function, could play a big role in autism.
So like even small differences in how interneurons are wired or how they're communicating during brain development could have these lasting effects.
Yeah, exactly. Interneurons are super important in shaping those neural circuits as the brain is developing, making sure the right connections get made. And if that process gets messed up somehow, it can lead to all sorts of problems.
Wow. It's just incredible to think about these tiny cells having such a huge impact on how our brains develop and how we function.
It really is. But, thinking about all this, it makes you wonder, if problems with interneurons are involved in so many different disorders, like, how can we even begin to develop effective treatments?
Yeah, that's a good point. It seems like trying to target something so fundamental could have all sorts of unintended consequences.
It's definitely a challenge. But, we're learning more and more about interneurons all the time. Like, the more we understand about the different types and how they function, the better chance we have of developing targeted therapies.
Okay, so what might those targeted therapies look like?
Well, one promising approach is to develop drugs that can specifically act on certain types of interneurons.
Drugs that can, like, control those traffic cops?
In a way, yes. For example, with epilepsy, researchers are looking into drugs that could enhance the activity of those GABA interneurons we talked about, boost their inhibitory effects.
So basically fine-tuning the traffic control system to restore that balance.
Exactly. And another approach that's being explored is gene therapy, like using gene therapy to try to correct genetic defects in interneurons or maybe even enhance their function.
Gene therapy, wow. So we're talking about actually manipulating these cells at the genetic level.
It's still early days for that kind of research,
Right.
but it has huge potential.
It does. But, like you said, the brain is so complex. How do we even know which interneurons to target? And how do we make sure that we're not, like, accidentally messing up some other important process?
Those are the million-dollar questions. Yeah. But, we're making progress. Like, with those advanced imaging techniques, we can actually study individual interneurons in living brains. And when you combine that with genetic tools, it's like we're finally starting to unravel the complexities of the brain.
It's like we're piecing together a giant puzzle, one tiny interneuron at a time.
A very intricate puzzle.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a great analogy. And as we learn more, the hope is that we'll eventually be able to develop more effective, more targeted therapies.
I see, but I'm guessing it'll take time.
Oh, absolutely. Research takes time, especially when you're dealing with something as complex as the brain. But the progress we've made, even just in the last few decades, it's really encouraging.
It is. It feels like we're on the verge of some major breakthroughs.
I think so, too. And, beyond developing treatments, all this research on interneurons, it's also changing our understanding of the healthy brain, like how it works, its basic functions.
Oh, right, of course. We've been focusing so much on disorders, but these findings also tell us a lot about how our brains operate normally. Like that whole thing about synchronized brain activity being triggered by single interneuron.
Right. It really challenges our old view of the brain as this collection of separate modules, each doing its own thing. Instead, it's looking more and more like the brain works as this complex interconnected network. Activities constantly flowing and shifting across different regions.
Like that orchestra analogy you used earlier.
Exactly. The interneurons are conducting this intricate dance of neural activity, making sure everything works together seamlessly.
And every thought, every feeling, every experience, it's all a product of this incredible interplay.
It really is mind-blowing when you think about it. It makes you wonder, what are the limits of this interconnectedness? If one tiny interneuron can have such a big impact, what other amazing things are we going to discover about the brain?
It's almost like we're just scratching the surface. And, it makes me think about consciousness. Like, how does consciousness even arise from this physical matter? Do you think these findings about interneurons and synchronized activity could offer some clues?
It's definitely possible. I mean, think about it. For consciousness to emerge, there has to be some way for information to be integrated across all the different parts of the brain.
Right.
And maybe this synchronized activity that we're seeing, maybe that's part of the mechanism. Maybe interneurons are helping to create that unified experience out of all the neural activity.
Whoa. That's a pretty profound idea.
It is. We're getting into some deep philosophical territory here, though. It's fascinating to think about.
It really is. But I also realize we have to be careful not to get too carried away with speculation.
Oh, for sure. We have to stay grounded in the science. But I think it's great to ask those big questions, to keep pushing the boundaries of what we know.
Absolutely. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we still don't know.
Exactly. And that's what makes science so exciting. There's always more to discover.
Okay, so before we get too lost in the philosophical weeds, let's bring it back down to earth for a minute. We've talked about how interneurons might be targeted to treat neurological disorders. But what about, enhancing cognitive function in healthy people? Is that something researchers are looking into?
Oh, definitely. It's still early days, but there's a lot of interest in that possibility. Some researchers think that, by tweaking interneuron activity, we might be able to boost things like learning and memory.
Wow, that would be incredible. But I imagine there are some pretty serious ethical considerations there, too.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime we start talking about enhancing cognitive function, we have to be super careful. We need to think about fairness, access, and the potential for misuse.
Right. It's not something to be taken lightly. We need to make sure we're approaching these advancements responsibly.
Completely agree. It's crucial to have those ethical conversations right from the start.
Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. From the basics of how interneurons work, to their potential role in shaping consciousness, to the ethics of cognitive enhancement.
We have. It's been a pretty mind-expanding conversation.
Yeah.
It really has been. And, going back to what we were saying before about interneurons and disorders, it also reminds us of how incredibly adaptable the brain is,
Oh, yeah, that's right. We tend to think of the brain as being fixed, but it's actually constantly changing and adapting to our experiences.
Exactly. It's incredibly plastic. And interneurons, they're a big part of that. They're not just passively directing traffic, but actually shaping and refining those neural circuits throughout our lives.
So every time we learn something new or have a new experience, those interneurons are busy rewiring our brains.
You got it. By strengthening or weakening connections between neurons, interneurons basically sculpt those neural pathways that, form the basis of our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors.
It's incredible to think that these tiny cells can have such a profound effect on who we are, on how our brains develop and function.
It really is. And the amazing thing is, the more we learn about interneurons, the more we realize how much we still don't know. There's so much more to discover.
So what are some of the most exciting areas of research that are happening right now in this field?
Well, one area that's really taking off is the development of new tools that allow us to manipulate interneuron activity with even greater precision.
Even more precise than optogenetics.
Well, optogenetics is still a powerful tool, but researchers are also exploring other techniques like chemogenetics, which uses these engineered receptors to activate specific neurons with designer drugs.
So we're not just observing interneuron activity anymore, but actually being able to control it.
Exactly. And with that level of control, we can start testing all sorts of hypotheses about the roles of specific types of interneurons, in different brain functions.
That opens up so many possibilities. What are some of the potential applications of these new techniques?
Well, one obvious application is in developing new treatments for neurological disorders, right? Like, if we can target specific interneuron circuits, we might be able to restore that balance in brain activity that's disrupted in conditions like epilepsy or autism.
That would be incredible, to actually be able to go in and fix those faulty circuits.
It's definitely a long-term goal, but it's a possibility. And beyond treating disorders, some researchers believe that these techniques could also be used to enhance cognitive function in healthy individuals.
Really? Like making people smarter?
Well, it's more nuanced than that, but yeah, the idea is that by boosting the activity of certain interneurons, you might be able to improve things like learning and memory.
Wow, that sounds pretty sci-fi. But also a little bit scary. I mean, who gets to decide who gets their brain enhanced? And what are the long-term consequences of messing with something as complex as the brain?
You're hitting on some really important ethical considerations there. And those are exactly the kinds of questions that scientists and ethicists are grappling with right now. Like, any attempt to enhance cognitive function raises all sorts of questions about fairness, access, and the potential for unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's definitely something we need to be very careful about. We don't want to create a world where only certain people have access to these kinds of enhancements.
Exactly. It's crucial to have those ethical conversations right from the start and to make sure that these technologies are developed and used responsibly.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of interneurons. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the basics of how these tiny cells work to their potential role in shaping consciousness and the ethical considerations of cognitive enhancement.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. And I have to say, I'm walking away with a newfound appreciation for the incredible complexity and adaptability of the human brain.
Me too. It's a truly remarkable organ.
And I think we've all learned a lot from this deep dive. So, to our listeners, thank you for joining us. And as always, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.